In an amazing development, Razer teamed up with Lambda Labs to make the TensorBook, a laptop made for deep learning that runs Linux out of the box.
Microsoft seems committed to turning Windows into the biggest dumpster fire humanly possible, and Valve is pushing the Steam Deck and Steam Machine, both of which run Linux. And, judging by the success of things like the Steam Deck, Linux is looking like a legitimate alternative to Windows as a gaming OS.
Linux word these days, right? I feel like every morning there's a new headline stating it's the year of Linux and that we're in the middle of some grand open source revolution. But why? To put it simply, Microsoft sucks and they've been sucking extra hard lately.
Razer. The brand that built its entire identity, its software ecosystem, its peripheral empire, and its reputation inside the Windows gaming world. The company whose hardware has been synonymous with Windows gaming since the day they shipped their first laptop. That company put Linux on their flagship hardware at the biggest consumer electronics trade show in the world and said nothing about it publicly. And that silence is precisely what should terrify Microsoft. Because premium gaming hardware brands do not experiment in public unless they have already done the math behind closed doors. They do not put a flagship product on display running a non-Windows operating system at CES without having calculated the risk of that signal and deciding the signal was worth sending. Razer did the math. The math told them something. And whatever it told them was alarming enough that the most Windows-loyal gaming brand on the planet decided that being publicly visible in the Linux gaming space, even quietly, was more important than maintaining the appearance of unconditional Windows loyalty. This is not the story of one laptop at one trade show. This is the story of what that laptop represents and what is building underneath it. The gaming industry's relationship with Windows is fracturing. The fracture is slow, quiet, and being driven by forces that are compounding simultaneously from multiple directions. And Razer's CES appearance is the moment that the most loyal brand in gaming hardware added its name to the list of companies that have looked at where this is heading and started preparing for a world where Windows is no longer the required foundation.
Sick of Windows, you've reached the end of your tether, as it were. You're pissed off with Microsoft, you don't want to use Mac, you want to try and make the transition over to Linux. You've seen people having a good...
To understand why Razer's move carries the weight it does, you have to understand the history of why gaming was always Windows' most impenetrable fortress. For 30 years, the argument was so simple it never needed to be made explicitly. You game on Windows because games run on Windows. Full stop. Not because gamers evaluated operating system architectures and concluded Windows was technically superior. Because the games they wanted to play were built for Windows, optimized for Windows, and in many cases would not function on anything else. The gaming software ecosystem created a lock-in so complete that no amount of frustration with Windows' other decisions, the telemetry, the forced updates, the hardware requirements, the AI features nobody asked for, was enough to make a serious gaming switch viable. You could be genuinely furious with Microsoft and still need Windows because your game library lived inside it. Valve broke that argument in February 2022 when they launched the Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device running SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system, sold millions of units to hardcore gamers who had never consciously chosen Linux in their lives. They were not making an ideological statement about open-source software. They were not switching operating systems out of principle. They were buying a device that ran their games. And it did. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, software that translates Windows game code to execute on Linux, worked well enough that most Steam Deck users never thought about the fact that they were gaming on Linux. They thought about the games. The games worked. That was the entire conversation for the people buying the hardware. Over 19,000 titles on Steam are now verified or playable on Linux through Proton. Not indie titles from small developers making Linux compatibility a priority. The same titles sitting in Windows users' Steam libraries. The same games, running on Linux. Working. That single development by Valve ripped out the foundational argument that had kept Windows gaming dominance structurally unassailable for 3 decades. Once games run on Linux, the question of which operating system you run them on becomes a question with more than one answer. And, once there is more than one answer, every frustration with Windows becomes grounds for reconsidering the relationship. The hardware industry read Valve's signal fast, and has been responding with a consistency that is now impossible to frame as coincidental. Dell has shipped Linux laptops. Lenovo offers official Linux support across multiple ThinkPad and IdeaPad product lines and has been expanding those offerings systematically. ASUS released handheld gaming hardware running Linux-based operating systems. Lenovo dropped the Legion Go S with SteamOS support. Multiple third-party handheld manufacturers are shipping devices with SteamOS or Linux-based systems out of the box as the primary operating system rather than as an alternative option. The pattern across major PC hardware companies is not a trend. It is a structural shift happening simultaneously across the entire industry, driven by manufacturers independently reaching the same conclusion about where the market is moving and positioning themselves accordingly. When Razer adds its name to that list, even quietly, even without a press release, the picture becomes something that Microsoft cannot comfortably dismiss. Because Razer is not a workstation manufacturer hedging toward enterprise Linux. Razer is not a developer-focused brand adding Linux as an option for technical users. Razer is the aspirational gaming hardware brand. The brand whose products signal gaming identity. The brand whose green and black aesthetic is displayed on streaming setups specifically because it communicates a specific relationship to gaming culture. When that brand puts Linux on its flagship laptop, it says, it is not making a technical statement. It is making a cultural statement about where serious gaming hardware is heading. And cultural statements from aspirational brands move markets in ways that technical improvements alone never could. NVIDIA was the wall. For years, it was the legitimate technical argument that kept Linux gaming from being viable for the majority of gamers who had invested in NVIDIA GPUs, historically the dominant choice for high-performance gaming. NVIDIA's Linux driver support was genuinely poor. Performance was inconsistent and often significantly behind what the same hardware delivered on Windows. Advanced features were missing or poorly implemented. Professional Linux users avoided NVIDIA hardware for exactly the reasons that mattered to them. Gaming users had an equally solid case that NVIDIA and Linux did not produce a gaming experience worth committing to. NVIDIA has been systematically dismantling that argument. Their open-source kernel driver rollout changed the architectural relationship between NVIDIA hardware and the Linux kernel in ways that improve both stability and performance. Vulkan performance on Linux with NVIDIA hardware has improved substantially. GeForce Now, NVIDIA's cloud gaming service, has been expanded to Linux devices. A commercial decision that signals NVIDIA's assessment that the Linux gaming market is large enough to justify serving directly. The company that created the most credible technical barrier to Linux gaming viability has been removing that barrier piece by piece, driven by market signals telling them that the Linux user base is growing and that their hardware needs to work on it. The last major technical excuse for Linux gaming being unviable is being dismantled by the company that built it. AMD never had this problem. Their open-source AMD driver has been built into the Linux kernel for years. Vulkan performance on Linux with AMD hardware is exceptional. Frame rates on AMD GPUs running Linux regularly come within 1 to 3% of equivalent Windows performance. And frame pacing, the consistency of frame delivery that determines how smooth gameplay actually feels beyond raw frame count numbers, is frequently better on Linux than Windows. For gamers running AMD hardware who have been waiting for a reason to try Linux, the technical story is already there. The performance is there. The driver support is there. The argument that Linux gaming is technically inferior on AMD hardware does not hold up against current benchmarks. The anti-cheat situation requires honest assessment rather than either dismissal or catastrophizing, because the nuance matters for understanding the real shape of the barrier. Kernel-level anti-cheat systems including Vanguard, used by Valorant, and the system running in Call of Duty block Linux at the driver level. These are genuine barriers. Players who primarily play these specific titles cannot currently do so on Linux. This is real, and acknowledging it is necessary for an honest picture. But Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye, two of the most widely deployed anti-cheat systems across the gaming industry, both added official Linux support years ago. Games running these systems work on Linux through Proton without special configuration. The titles blocking Linux are making a business decision, not responding to a technical impossibility. The infrastructure to support Linux exists in the most commonly deployed anti-cheat systems. The remaining holdouts are choices. And choices change when the commercial calculation behind them changes. The moment any major publisher's Linux user base crosses the threshold where serving those users represents meaningful revenue, the anti-cheat Linux support switch gets flipped. The technical work has already been done in the most widely used systems. The business decision is what remains. And business decisions are responsive to user base size in ways that technical limitations are not. Razer's Synapse software is the dimension of their SES positioning that most technology coverage missed, and that carries significant long-term implications. Synapse has been Windows only since its inception, the peripheral management software controlling Razer lighting effects, macro configurations, performance profiles, and device settings across their entire ecosystem. It has been a genuine lock-in mechanism. Users who have invested in a Razer peripheral ecosystem have had Synapse as a dependency, and Synapse has meant Windows. But Razer has been quietly migrating functionality toward browser-based tools and cloud-connected features. Software that runs in a browser does not care what operating system is underneath it. The migration from installed applications to web platforms is happening across the entire industry simultaneously. And for Windows, it is architecturally catastrophic, because installed software dependency was the mechanism through which operating system lock-in was maintained for millions of users. Beyond gaming itself, creative professionals stayed on Windows because Adobe's creative tools were Windows optimized and Windows native. Gamers stayed on Windows because their game launchers, anti-cheat systems, and peripheral software were Windows only. Enterprise users stayed on Windows because their business applications required it. As each category of software migrates toward browser-based delivery or web-connected functionality, the operating system dependency that category represented dissolves. You cannot maintain platform lock-in through software that runs identically in Chrome regardless of what operating system Chrome is installed on. Razer building browser-based peripheral management infrastructure is Razer building the pathway for their own hardware to become operating system agnostic. That is not a small decision from a company whose business was built inside the Windows ecosystem. Cloud gaming accelerates the decoupling between games and operating systems in ways that bypass the anti-cheat barrier, the driver compatibility question, and the software dependency issue simultaneously. GeForce Now streams full PC games, including titles that block Linux through kernel-level anti-cheat, directly to a browser. The game executes on NVIDIA's servers. The client machine displays the output. GeForce Now runs on Linux. It runs on a Chromebook. It runs on a device that could never locally execute the games being streamed. When the game is running on remote infrastructure and the client device is purely a display terminal, the operating system on the client device is irrelevant to the gaming experience. Microsoft cannot maintain gaming platform lock-in when the games are not running on the user's machine. The operating system on the local device becomes infrastructure rather than experience, the same transition that happened in productivity computing when everything moved to browser-based applications. And once the operating system becomes infrastructure rather than experience, the choice of operating system becomes a decision made on criteria that have nothing to do with game compatibility. The irony worth stating plainly is that gaming infrastructure has been running on Linux for decades at the server level. The matchmaking systems, cloud save infrastructure, patch delivery systems, and back-end architecture for almost every major online game runs on Linux servers. When you queue into a match in any major online title, connect to the servers handling your session, or sync your progress across devices, you are overwhelmingly connecting to Linux-based infrastructure. Gaming already depends on Linux at its operational core. The only place Linux was historically absent was in front of the player. The Steam Deck started changing that. The handheld gaming device market has accelerated the change. Proton's expansion made the change viable for a growing portion of the library. And now, Razer's SES positioning signals that the change is progressing from niche adoption into something that major gaming hardware brands are factoring into their product strategy. Linux gaming distributions have collapsed the setup barrier to a degree that makes the complexity argument untenable for anyone who has actually installed one recently. Bazite, Nobara, and Pop! OS are built specifically for gaming, pre-configured with drivers, Proton integration, and Steam installed so that a fresh setup is functional in under 20 minutes. This is not the Linux of 2015 where setting up a gaming environment required spending a weekend in terminal windows fighting dependency conflicts and driver issues. The experience is clean, guided, and produces a working gaming setup faster than a fresh Windows installation with all the associated account creation, privacy settings navigation, OneDrive configuration, and Microsoft 365 dismissal that Windows 11 setup now requires. The communities surrounding gaming-focused Linux distributions are flooded with accounts from users who made the switch expecting to return to Windows and never did. Not because Linux is perfect, but because the experience was better than they expected and the ongoing experience better than what they left. The Steam hardware survey numbers showing Linux at 3 to 5% of the Steam user base are regularly used to dismiss Linux gaming as marginal. That framing misrepresents what the number represents. Windows comes pre-installed on virtually every gaming PC sold by default. Switching to Linux requires a deliberate decision, a download, creating installation media, and a willingness to change something that most people have never thought about. 3 to 5% of Steam users who have gone through that process voluntarily, driven by genuine preference rather than default behavior, represents intentional adoption of a kind that scales differently than passive default usage. Intentional adopters advocate for their choice. They share their experience. They reduce the perceived risk for the next person considering the same switch. Default users do not advocate because they made no choice worth advocating for. The intentional adoption curve is the one that matters for understanding where this is heading, and it has been moving consistently upward. Microsoft's position in gaming faces a structural problem that product improvements cannot fully address because it is not primarily a product quality problem. Windows 11 ships with advertising in the start menu. It runs telemetry continuously. It pushes forced updates at times users did not choose. It nudges users toward Microsoft accounts, Edge, Microsoft 365, and OneDrive at every opportunity. The operating system has been progressively transformed from a tool that serves the person using it into a platform that extracts value from the person using it. Through data collection, through subscription promotion, through advertising, through ecosystem lock-in. For users who are already frustrated with this, the gaming barrier was the primary reason to stay regardless. Proton's expansion has been removing that barrier. As the gaming barrier weakens, every other frustration becomes grounds for reconsidering the relationship on its own merits. And the operating system that Linux presents for that reconsideration, no ads, no telemetry, no forced updates, no account requirements, full control of the computing environment, looks fundamentally different from what Windows has become when evaluated on those dimensions. The dominant position collapses not from a single competitor defeating it directly. Nokia did not lose to a single competitor. BlackBerry did not lose to a single competitor. They lost to the accumulation of alternatives chipping away at every specific reason users had for staying until the aggregate case for the incumbent fell apart. Proton chipped away at game compatibility. The Steam Deck chipped away at the idea that Linux gaming is a fringe experiment rather than a mainstream viable option. AMD resolved the driver excuse. GeForce Now chipped away at the need for a gaming operating system at all. Bazzite and Nobara chipped away at the complexity barrier. And now, Razer, the most Windows-loyal gaming hardware brand in the industry, chipped away at the idea that premium gaming brands only exist and only make sense inside the Microsoft ecosystem. What Razer did at CES 2026 was not a product launch. It was a positioning decision made by a company that has watched the trajectory of gaming's relationship with Windows for 3 years, observed the Steam Deck's commercial success, tracked Proton's library expansion to 19,000 titles, watched NVIDIA fix the driver problem that had been the last. Credible technical barrier, and calculated that being caught unprepared when the shift accelerates is a larger business risk than being visible in the Linux gaming space before the shift is complete. They are not betting that Linux replaces Windows in gaming tomorrow. They are making certain they are relevant when it does. That is the kind of positioning decision that only gets made when the math behind closed doors points clearly enough in one direction that waiting feels more dangerous than moving. Microsoft still runs 90% of gaming PCs. The competitive multiplayer anti-cheat barrier is real for the titles maintaining it. The transition effort is genuine and will deter casual users who have no strong motivation beyond default inertia. None of this is being dismissed. But every technology market disruption in history has looked stable from the outside until the moment it stopped looking stable. The argument that Nokia had a dominant position was accurate until suddenly it was historical. The argument that BlackBerry owned Enterprise Mobile was accurate until suddenly it was a cautionary tale. The argument that Windows gaming was unassailable because games only run on Windows was the most durable lock-in argument in consumer computing, and Valve's Proton made it obsolete. What remains is a dominant position built on inertia and ecosystem depth rather than on a genuinely superior experience. In a market where the alternatives have become good enough that the switching cost is declining every quarter, Razer building Linux products, even quietly, even without a press release, is the moment the most recognizable name in gaming hardware equipment acknowledged that the Windows gaming monopoly is optional rather than permanent. That signal travels through the industry faster than any announcement Microsoft could make in response. And the gamers, developers, hardware manufacturers, and anti-cheat providers watching it are all running the same calculation that Razer already ran. The question is not whether Windows gaming dominance ends. The question is how long before the rest of the industry stops pretending it is inevitable.